Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you are very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. A couple of months ago, as I think I mentioned in my email that I send out, I was trying to make plans to go and see Firebrand in the cinema just after it had been released. At that time though, I was very pregnant, pretty uncomfortable, and frankly dreaded the thought of having to sit in one place for 2 hours. So the spirit was willing, but the flesh was weak. However, huzzahs all around, because Firebrand has been released on a streaming service that I have access to. And so this week, baby Dominic and I sat down to watch the film, and I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on it in this video. Dominic's told me that he does need some more time to consider his opinion, and I think it's important to be thoughtful about these things. As we all know, copyright is an unforgiving mistress, so any images that I manage to find from the film, I am probably going to have to use sparingly, if that is, I can use them at all. Either way though, I want to talk about my experience of watching it, whether I can use images or not. So, let's take a look at Firebrand. This film is based on Elizabeth Fremantle's debut 2013 novel, originally titled Queen's Gambit, which was republished in 2024, so this summer just gone, as Firebrand so that it would match the film. Today's video is going to be a review of the film rather than the book. So my focus is going to be on the plot as it's shown on screen, the character and costuming choices, among other aspects. And I will be paying particular attention to the historical accuracy or otherwise of the film. Now, on that note, and this is going to be a possible hint with regards to the historical accuracy of this film, at least as I see it, I am going to issue a spoiler warning here for those who have not seen the film and who don't want to know what happens in it. Because even if you have got a firm knowledge of the historical record of the period being depicted here, you may be, in fact, you will be, surprised by what happens. So perhaps you want to pause this video and come back after you've watched the film. I do have lots of other videos for you to check out in my playlists in the meantime. Right, for those of you who are still here, let's jump right in. The first thing I noticed, probably unsurprisingly as it is a film, were the choices being made in terms of cinematography. I thought that I had maybe clicked onto the wrong film when it first opened, because Firebrand opens on a blasted heath. I thought I was watching Macbeth. There was a thick mist rolling round craggy rocks that looked to be covered in maybe heather or something. There were rooks or crows on one of these rocks. It felt very much like the weird sisters were about to appear. And indeed, the film, particularly in its interior scenes, is pretty darkly lit. You can't really see into the corners of rooms. There's a sense, perhaps, that there could be people lurking in them, listening to what's said, plotting within them. It's filmed on location at Haddon Hall, which is in the Peak District. Parts of this hall are reportedly 900 years old, but over the intervening years it has been added to, with some of the sections being Tudor additions. The set and the decoration added to it is really opulent. There's lots of elaborately painted walls, there's rich velvet fabrics, there's damasks, and there is dark wood furniture. If I were to be really picky, and I'm going to be, there is part of me that wishes that in certain circumstances the colours had been a bit more varied and a bit brighter. There was a sense of tone of maybe reds and blues. I sort of wanted to see more colour clashing, because in my mind that is actually more evocative of the period as it actually was. There were incredibly bright colours. I think if you walked into a Tudor royal court, it would almost be an assault to the eyes because of how bright it was. And perhaps this film would have looked like that if it had been lit more brightly. Certainly in the exterior scenes, you do see some very bright costuming. And maybe the choice was made to keep it dark inside because to light it in a really bright way probably would have detracted from the overall feeling of the film, because it is definitely being presented as a dark thriller. On the topic of costume, this is for me where this film really shines. We are seeing linen shirts, both high neck variety and the square necked variety. They are decorated with black work embroidery at court, really typical for the period and really beautiful examples of it. I think the thing that I was most happy to see, we don't see the ladies stripped of their undergarments very often in this film, and I kind of wish we had a little bit more, which might sound odd, but they are doing it so beautifully. These linen shifts are so voluminous and so fine, but what I loved is that when they have their stays on, their pairs of bodies, what we might call corsetry, they are being worn over the top of the shifts. They aren't sitting against the skin. This is how it was in the Tudor period. What we didn't see a lot of in this film were women particularly wearing caps or coifs in bed as a general rule. Now, that's not appropriate historically. They would have been wearing caps or coifs in bed in private. We see Henry wearing these caps and coifs. However, I do think that the choice not to put the ladies in these coifs or caps in the more domestic, private settings is another choice. Because we do have the ladies with their hair being braided up with ribbons or laces, and these are really intricate styles of braiding. And what I think is really interesting about it is the way the hair has been laced or pinned to the head. It does look like it would have really helped to hold the headwear in place. So it seems to me they've done quite a lot of research on how the hair might have been bound up. And there's probably a hairstylist who didn't want all of that research to go to waste underneath a cap or coif throughout the entirety of the film. So I'm pleased to see the braiding, even though they probably would have had it under a cap or a coif. The gowns, the suits, the accessories we're seeing, they are beautifully detailed, and in many cases they look to be almost exact replicas from extant portraits, like this one. Catherine in the black bonnet and the English gown. This is the portrait gown that she wears when she meets with the council, which she does when she is acting as regent while Henry VIII is away fighting in France. I do think it's interesting that they chose to use this gown with this bonnet-style hat, because the bonnet-style hat is one that is more commonly worn by men in this period, although of course women did also wear it. So I think it's interesting they chose to put her in this to meet with the council. Even when the gowns and garments aren't direct replica copies from portraits, it is evident that they have been very well researched and certainly inspired by the clothing that we do see in those portraits. We have lots of French hoods on show in this film. Many of them are pushed really far back to see that central part, lots and lots of hair on display. These French hoods are being held in place often with a strap under the chin. This is another thing that we do see coming out of the portraiture. The French hoods often come with French gowns, and those are spectacularly detailed. We have these fabulous full sleeves with pull-throughs of fabric. The sleeves frequently match the underskirts. What I love the most is the stomachers. That's a piece of fabric that sits right on the front of these French gowns over the stomach and chest. It's there to hide the lacing that would be in the front of the gown, and those stomachers would have been pinned onto the dress. All too often in modern costuming, they make it as one plain, clear piece of fabric, a dress that fits all together. In every instance where you see a stomacher in this film, it's very clearly a separate piece of material that looks to me to have been pinned in place. I love the fact that we also got to see some gable hoods too, and I think also something approximating English or transitional hoods. There's not one uniform dress or style on display here. The fashions or less fashionable choices are all being shown, and I think it's really great to see that variety. We also have differentiation in elite dress depending on the setting, so whether they're in council or at a court celebration. Particularly at the court celebrations, we are seeing brighter, richer fabrics in more ornamented styles and cuts. When we see those courtiers, though, out riding, traipsing through the woods, the clothing becomes less elaborate. The train is shorter, but they are, of course, well covered. When they're in their private chambers, it's much more relaxed. They are in their linen shifts. On occasion as well, they are in fur-lined dressing gowns, very appropriate for the period. It's also, I think, great to see a similar variety of clothing for non-noble, non-courtly individuals, those kinds of lower status, in quotes, clothes. There's lots of jewellery on display, much of which seems to be either direct replicas of, or certainly heavily inspired by, the extant portrait images we have from this period. We get a brief moment where Henry VIII is shown wearing glasses. And we know that Henry VIII had multiple pairs of glasses as he aged and as his vision became more and more impaired. There's also a moment in the film where Henry asks to wear his crown. And I think the crown they're going for is this one. I'm hoping I can show a picture of it. This is currently on display at Hampton Court Palace. It's a reconstruction of Henry VIII's crown. And as you can see, it's lined with royal purple. The crown I think we saw on screen didn't look like this. It was fairly darkly lit, so perhaps I mistook what I saw, and it was only on screen for a brief moment, but it looked to me like the crown in the film was sitting on top of some sort of velvet bonnet. I think a black velvet bonnet, which is not what this crown is doing. So while this crown may be somewhat anachronistic, may be inaccurate, what is the case is that for the most part, the costuming choices made in regards to this film, as far as I'm concerned, were spectacular. From the ground up, from the undergarments all the way out to the outer garments, these are researched, thought out choices. And that is fairly rare to see in film and TV. There are a few examples of productions that do it, but Firebrand does it really well. Let's hop into talking about the film's plot now. The film opens with the young Elizabeth as the narrator, and she seems to be echoing the language of fairy tales in setting up this story. And I think that's a very interesting choice, because what we have there is a reason, a get out of jail free card, if you will, to play kind of fast and loose with the historical narrative. This is not a historical story. This is a story told from a historical person's point of view, namely a young girl's point of view, Elizabeth's. So if there is a disconnect with the, in quotes, facts as we know them, well, this is the opinion, the view of history as seen by, effectively, a young girl. Catherine, now Queen of England, has been left as regent while her husband, King Henry, is off fighting in France. Katherine Parr is played by Alicia Vikander, and she's playing her as this outwardly obedient, at least for the most part, fiercely intelligent, faithful, calm, loving and caring individual, very like that royal nursemaid wife that much of history thinks of Katherine Parr as being. But in this film, that is only one facet of who she actually is, because this Katherine Parr is fiercely devout, fervent in her religion, willing to scheme politically, perhaps, we are shown, even support a military fight for the faith that she believes to be the true one. There are lots of things to enjoy about her performance. I really thought it was stand out. For me, though, there is something so compelling about the way she controls her stillness, the way she has this outward presentation of calm that she shows before her husband Henry, and that is so totally believable because, of course, Henry would have had to buy it. But while she's doing all of this, at the very same time, she's able to present herself so that the audience is completely aware of the panic that sits just below the surface of that calm. Alicia Vikander is so fully in control of herself and the material. I just thought she did the most exceptional job. She has this, I think maybe control of her breathing. You can sort of hear it speed up a bit, just ever so slightly. It becomes a little bit ragged. When she's under stress as she walks, there's this almost imperceptible but still present buckling of the knees. You have to be really watching her, but you can feel her building terror. You feel like you're walking right along that knife edge with her. The film's soundtrack also certainly helped to raise this sense of tension, though, because in moments of danger within the plot, the soundtrack becomes muffled. I think it's almost as if we're hearing it through Katherine Parr's ears. We see the fear she's feeling, we hear the fear she's feeling, because it seems to almost drown out all other sound. In the plot, it's a time of plague in England, and the royal children have been brought with Catherine to be kept safe. They are sleeping with her in her rooms. In fact, they are sharing her bed. Now, Catherine is regent in 1544, and there are records of there being scattered outbreaks of plague in England during this year. At one point in the film, though, Prince Edward complains that he's bored, that he wants to return to Hampton Court. The problem is that historically, Hampton Court is where the real Katherine Parr held court during this regency, and while she was there, she did in fact have all of the royal children around her. After this moment, we do then travel with Catherine into the forest. In this forest, she is watching a woman preach. This woman, we later find out, is Anne Askew. Anne is shown speaking out against the power of priests and of kings. She says they should not be able to tell people what they should believe. Anne Askew is shown calling for a revolution, possibly even a regicide. While down the line, Anne Askew would be found to be heretical in the terms of Henrician England, there's no evidence that her teachings were deemed to be treasonous. So, presumably, there's no point where she is explicitly calling for the potential overthrow of the king, and that is something we see her doing in this film. Also, Katherine Parr and Anne Askew in the film are shown to know each other and to know each other well. These are women that have a history. Later on, Anne talks about sitting with Katherine Parr and weeping before her first marriage. Catherine has come to present Anne Askew with a copy of the book she's written, a book that was published. This is historical fact. And although in the reality of history there were suspicions that Anne Askew did have connections in the Queen's household, possibly even with the Queen herself, there is nothing recorded that would support them being childhood friends, which is how the film presents it having been. Indeed, Catherine is thought to have been around a decade older than Anne, so the chance of them being childhood friends, I think, is somewhat out of the window with that. Catherine claims that her husband, Henry VIII, is allowing her to educate Edward and Elizabeth in the new faith, not to take charge of their education through tutors, but her herself. We see Elizabeth being guided in her translations of the Bible by Katherine Parr. Now, in the historical record, Catherine did reportedly take great interest in the care and upbringing of these royal children, but both of them had numerous tutors they could access who were guiding them in their educational labours. This was not Katherine Parr's job. While this makeshift schoolroom / working political office is underway, Thomas Seymour comes to visit Katherine Parr in her rooms. The pair are overfamiliar, frankly. They are flirtatious, and they are doing so in a way that if anybody were to see them who wanted to make problems for either one of them, they would find themselves in real trouble. They make reference to and are showing themselves to be people who have known each other for a time. And of course, in history, Thomas and Catherine were courting each other before her marriage to Henry, and after his death, they would end up being married. However, there is no evidence that during her marriage to the king, she and Thomas were anything other than courtier and queen. In the film, though, Catherine has not only this close relationship with Thomas Seymour, but also a close relationship with his elder brother, Edward Seymour. Catherine and the Seymours are being shown conspiring together to bring about religious change, to essentially force that change in faith through. Now, while it's entirely possible that these three individuals did work together during the king's lifetime, it is worth pointing out that there is certainly evidence that the relationship between the Seymour brothers was pretty strained, and after Catherine's marriage to Thomas Seymour, that she and Edward Seymour and his wife also had a strained relationship. That doesn't mean it was necessarily always strained, and they did seem to share some faith beliefs. So I'm not quite sure if they were ever this close, and I don't think they were ever really plotting to force through a faith change as this trio. There is soon going to be news that Henry VIII is returning early, and there is just mass panic. Katherine Parr once again goes to meet Anne Askew and tells her she has to flee. To do this, she hands Anne an incredibly expensive necklace that we will later find out had been a gift given to her by her husband, the king. She returns, and we get to meet Henry for the first time in this film. Henry is played by Jude Law. And Jude Law's Henry is not the swivel-eyed pantomime lunatic that the older Henry is normally played as. This is a man in agony, a man disappointed that his bad legs have forced him to return early from his much-loved military endeavours. He is embarrassed that he can't do the things he once did. He is short-tempered and suspicious. We get to see his leg. It looks horrific, and it appears to smell repulsive. Indeed, I've read articles where Jude Law says that he went to a perfumier and had them make up a fragrance that would smell like, effectively, rotting flesh. So for the actors working with him, when they look like they're smelling something disgusting, they almost certainly were. I do think, though, that Jude Law's portrayal of Henry is somehow sympathetic. Henry's not likeable, but he does feel real. And I think perhaps this is happening because Jude Law isn't leaning into pantomime malevolence. His Henry can be jovial. He can play at the virginals and sing his own composition, Pastime with Good Company. The court in rapturous applause around him because, of course, they can't do anything else. Jude Law's Henry is human, and in many ways, that actually makes him more chilling. When he speaks to Catherine, offers her a warning on how to behave, is he warning his wife about the court factions that might try to bring her down, or is he threatening her to know her place? It's really hard to tell, and I think that's the point. Jude Law's Henry is a cruel man. He laughs at other people's misfortune. He is shown to be lascivious upon occasion. As the film goes on, though, we seem to see his pain getting worse, and as it does, his paranoia deepens. The danger he poses increases, and the violence that he begins to perpetrate on screen rises exponentially. Edward Seymour confirms to Katherine Parr that Anne Askew has been captured, tortured, and burned to death. Upon learning this, we see her knees buckle. She composes herself, at least we think she has, but then she makes the risky choice of confronting Henry. She talks about the damage he has done to his soul by the killing of Anne Askew. Henry reacts immediately with violence. He is instantly suspicious, and she is clearly terrified. She sets about cajoling him, massaging his ego. It's very clear just how risky, annoying Henry is, and it's also very clear that this Katherine Parr understands the fire that she is playing with. Henry's daughter Elizabeth in this film will express just how terrified of her father she is. She tells Katherine Parr that she believes that her father will one day kill her, as he did her mother. I also very much enjoyed Simon Russell Beale's portrayal of Bishop Stephen Gardiner, because like Jude Law's depiction of Henry, Simon Russell Beale is shying away from the usual one-dimensional, wicked, hateful schemer version of Gardiner, the zealot and bigot. Like Vikander's Katherine Parr, Russell Beale's Stephen Gardiner is shown to be fervent in his beliefs, and there is a truth to those beliefs. He seems to be desperate to preserve the peace of his nation and the immortal souls of his countrymen. Unfortunately, for two people who are in many ways so aligned, he and Catherine are diametrically opposed on how best to achieve these aims. And in this opposition, Catherine will be drawn to view Gardiner and his beliefs as being nothing more than superstition, bad for the soul of the nation, while Gardiner will come to see Catherine as a dangerous heretic who might infect king, court, and country. In terms of the historical relationship between the bishop and the queen, at least as far as we know it, There was an opposition at play. Catherine was naturally more inclined to reform. Stephen Gardiner was very suspicious of this. He certainly was concerned that there was a heretic right at the heart of Henry's court. From this point on, though, in the film, there is a growing deviation from the historical record, at least as far as we know it. First up, Queen Katherine Parr falls pregnant. Now, there is no historical record of Katherine Parr ever experiencing a pregnancy until after Henry's death. She falls pregnant in her next marriage to Thomas Seymour. She and Seymour would have a daughter, Mary, and Katherine Parr would die from complications from the birth of Mary. Following her pregnancy in the film, though, King Henry VIII announces that he has changed his will to make Catherine regent for his son Edward if he should come to the throne as a boy. When Bishop Gardiner learns of this, he speaks of his concerns about the choice with Henry. Henry appears angry to be questioned in this way. Gardiner, though, pushes further still. He mentions the Queen's faith, or rather, how her faith deviates from the official religion of state. It seems that Gardiner will not be backing down. Seeds of doubt about Catherine's faith and faithfulness are being sown in Henry's mind. Before long, he is shown drunkenly attacking his pregnant wife. She has announced her pregnancy to him. She becomes so desperate that she then pokes her fingers into his festering leg wound. This results in Henry being bedbound and seemingly non-verbal. Those around him set to work on him, to see if in his addled state they can make their will his, or at least make it seem as if they have. Catherine and Edward Seymour, though, are shown as being kept apart from him. They are pacing, waiting in a separate room, seemingly hoping for the king's speedy death. However, Henry regains consciousness, speech and thought, and Catherine finds herself barred from him. Now, what is the case is that during the last weeks of Henry's life, during his final sickness, Katherine Parr was kept at a distance from him. In fact, she was kept in a separate palace. The courtiers around him kept his worsening condition and his eventual death secret for a few days. They needed the time to set themselves up to rule in their own rights during the minority of King Edward VI. Katherine Parr is then shown on screen losing her baby. Now, why I think it's fairly evident that this is not true to the historical record is, in the film, she is sufficiently pregnant to inform Henry. She sees doctors. Her linens are searched. The entire court appears to know about this pregnancy. If such a pregnancy had taken place for Catherine, if it had gone to the length, the gestation that it appears to have gone to in this film, and she had then lost the baby, there is simply no way in my mind that it would not have made its way into the historical record. We would have known she was pregnant, and we would have known that there was no baby. So this seems to have been added in to the story. I'm not 100% sure of why, perhaps because then it gives more of a reason for the king to change his will. And through changing his will, that of course ramps up the tension. It drives people like Gardiner to try and move against her. So perhaps this pregnancy is a vehicle for making Katherine Parr more dangerous, more threatening to her enemies. It gives more of a reason to pull her down. What is interesting is, following the discovery that her pregnancy has ended, the court doctor comes to Catherine and tells her explicitly that she must not allow herself to fall like Henry's previous wives. This doctor, who claims to have served Catherine of Aragon, he appears to be an Arabic doctor that has come over with Catherine at the time of her marriage, presumably to Arthur. Now, this, in terms of the historical record, we know that she does bring individuals with her from the Alhambra. However, there is not a record of an Arabic doctor coming with her and then becoming a court doctor. There was, however, an Italian doctor who served both Catherine of Aragon and King Henry VIII and became the official king's doctor, the king's surgeon in this time. So perhaps this character is based on him. Either way, This medical professional goes on to discuss with the Queen just how soon her husband, the King, might die from his infected leg. Is he telling her to hold on, or perhaps suggesting that she might hasten the process? Either way, speaking of the King's death at all, imagining it even, was treason. We see an embittered Henry VIII complaining of the fact that he really believed that Catherine had loved him enough to give him a, quote, spare. He then turns to Stephen Gardiner so that he might help him remove yet another wife. Gardiner suggests that a charge of heresy might be a way to rid his king of Catherine in such a way that could not be used by the king's enemies to malign him. Henry then tells Gardiner to start his investigations. The use of that term, spare, to describe a second son, that phrase, heir and a spare, is certainly an old one, but it's likely not as old as the 16th century, so perhaps the use of that term is a little, in fact, perhaps more than a little, anachronistic here. And there are certainly some other anachronistic uses of language in this film. One example that springs to mind is from earlier in the film. Henry referred to the baby in Catherine's tummy. Now, that term tummy is not in use until the 19th century. The word belly would have been more fitting in this regard. We then see Henry starting to offer up pardons to anyone willing to provide evidence against Catherine. Essentially, if you want to save your own neck or your own place at court or your own place in the future king's reign, then you better give me something I can use. We see Katherine Parr being arrested out of her bed in front of Henry. Her ladies are taken at this time too. She is seemingly placed in a dungeon wearing just her shift. She is bareheaded. This depiction is not in line with the way that any imprisoned queen or indeed noblewoman was treated in England during this period. And we do have examples of a fair few being imprisoned during this time. Because of the rank of her birth, she would have been kept as her state demanded. She is, of course, at this point, still the king's wife, the Queen of England. She would not have been in a dungeon, shivering in her shift on a pallet bed. She would have been in luxurious palace rooms, perhaps in a prison, but luxurious rooms nevertheless. She would have been in fine clothes. She would have been very well fed if she had the stomach to eat, and she would have been attended by a legion of staff, much like her time at court. It may have been slightly pared back, but it would not have been like this. Additionally, although there was an arrest warrant signed for Katherine Parr by her husband on a charge of heresy, that arrest warrant was never properly enacted. Katherine Parr learns of the arrest warrant and somehow manages to dig deep enough to find the courage, and I don't know where she finds it from, to put herself before the king. Interestingly, Henry has signed the warrant but has stayed in the same palace. Usually, coward that he is, in my opinion, Henry would sign the arrest warrant and then he would leave. He would not be in the presence of a person that he had condemned in this way. He liked to flee the scene. But he stays in this case, which gives Catherine the opportunity in the real historical record to go and meet with him. And we're not entirely sure of what she says. But the story goes that Henry tried to goad her into talking of matters of faith. She would not be drawn, and so he pushes further still. He talks about how she had wanted to teach him matters of faith. She immediately, we are told, backtracks. No, indeed, sire. I was simply hoping to alleviate the pain in your leg by distracting you. And selfishly, of course, I thought that your superior knowledge might be able to fill my, delicate lady brain, and thus I would be enriched by your teaching. Henry apparently buys it. Is it really so, Kate? We are told he says, yes, indeed, sire, I'm sure. She bows and genuflects and kisses his hands and maybe his feet. And then, apparently, he says, well then, Kate, we are perfect friends again. Doesn't call off the arrest warrant, but he is with her when they come for her. And when they try to arrest his wife and queen, Henry berates them. How dare you? And while some might see this as a man losing his faculties, forgetting what he's done, being easily bidden, I think this is a man in full control of everybody around him. Stephen Gardiner and the Conservative faction were moving against his queen. His queen had overstepped in matters of faith. She was too reforming. This is a perfect way to put everyone back in line. Catherine has got a very real warning about potential heresy. Stephen Gardiner and his faction are being shown, "You may think you lead me by the nose, sirs, but believe me, if my hat knew my thoughts, I'd cast into the fire." Now everybody knows their place, and Henry wins the day again. But that's not the world we see in this film. Because Gardiner goes to visit Katherine Parr in her cell, and while there, she proclaims not only heretical, but also treasonous views before Gardiner. If she had been imprisoned and Gardiner had been sent to her, it would have been to question her, to elicit a confession from her. The words she uses to him, while they are completely powerful, would have been an admission of her guilt, not just of heresy, but of treason. From this scene, we go back to court. Henry sits in a gallery with his children. They look sombre, frankly, hangdog and miserable. Henry commands that Edward sing for him. Edward doesn't want to. He misses his mother, we are told. And it is certainly the case that Edward did view Katherine Parr as his mother, or at least as an approximation of a mother. She was, after all, the only mother he had really ever known. Similarly, this is the case for Elizabeth too. She is a very strong feature in their lives. And she was also very good friends with his eldest daughter, Mary. She had served in Mary's household. So all of these children know her, and it seems that they all love her. That is part of the historical fact. I doubt, though, they would have shown their displeasure quite so clearly to their father, particularly not in public. But that is what we see happening in the film. Henry's health weakens further. Once again, he takes to his bed. And we look around the court, and it does appear that almost everyone there is rooting for King Henry to die. We return to Catherine. She believes she is preparing herself to go out to be burned at the stake. In fact, she walks up to a pyre, but at the last minute she is rerouted, brought to court, and it's announced that Henry will only speak with her. She is sent into his rooms where he lays in bed in private. There, he asks her if she ever loved him. She pauses, and her response is, "I loved my king." That's not what he wants. He becomes distressed. "I love you, I love you." And she rests her arm on his neck and kills him. After his death, her mind, her thoughts turn to Anne Askew. So is Henry's death an act of revenge in part? It is worth pointing out, I think, right here, that there is absolutely no evidence that Henry died of anything other than ill health and thus natural causes. Certainly, Katherine Parr was in a separate palace when he passed away, and she hadn't come from a prison cell to see him either. There is no evidence that Katherine Parr killed Henry VIII on his deathbed, but that is what the film presents. At the end of the film, it is left to Elizabeth to deliver the epilogue, and it seems that she is looking forward to a brighter world. There are no pantomime baddies in the world of this film. Everyone, to varying degrees, is flawed in their own ways, weak, prone to moral failing at times, but they are also shown to be driven to do better. For their nation, their faith, their family, their friends, when they are making horrible, violent choices, as many of them do, this film presents them as seeing those choices as righteous, I think, or at least as the best out of a number of bad options. I think this film offers the audience an important reminder when it comes to the study of historical figures and their motivations. And it's something that certainly I strive to remember at all times, and that is, in history, in life itself, nobody thinks they are the bad guy. Last but by no means least, I do have some additional notes that I wasn't sure quite where to fit in earlier with regards to the historical accuracy or otherwise of this film. First up, there is some anachronism when it comes to the use of titles. Catherine's ladies refer to her by her first name. Henry's gentlemen call him Harry to his face. Now, granted, these occurrences are happening in their private rooms, in more intimate settings, so it is possible that there is a level of familiarity that might allow this among these people with these figures. However, they are still the king and queen, so titles like Your Grace or Your Majesty would be far more appropriate than Kate, Kit, Catherine, or Harry would be. Equally, in terms of the use of titles, there is a moment where Bishop Gardiner refers to Elizabeth as Your Highness. Now, this is Elizabeth, who, although added back into the line of succession, remains the illegitimate daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. She is not a princess royal of the blood because her parents, according to the law of that time, were not legally married. So the more appropriate name or title to give Elizabeth this phase would, I think, have been the Lady Elizabeth or simply My Lady. So there is some linguistic anachronism going on. Additionally, there are, though, things that I think are really standout moments of accuracy in this. I love the fact that we see people bathing using a basin and ewer. So warmed water in the ewer poured into the basin or poured over people and into the basin. There's a really nice moment where we see Katherine Parr cleaning her teeth. She's using a toothcloth and I think possibly charcoal. Certainly it looked like she was having a black powder rubbed on her teeth. So I think possibly charcoal is what's being shown here. We do see women riding horses astride rather than side saddle, which is an odd choice because side saddle is by far the most common way to ride and certainly in Tudor gowns. There is also a scene where we have a discussion of people who are due to be executed and their crimes are detailed before us. Included in this list of criminals are Margaret Pole, Henry Pole and Arthur Pole. We are told in the film that they are to be executed for heresy. So this is happening while Catherine is Henry's queen. Katherine Parr and Henry VIII had married in 1543. Arthur Pole, so one of the people on the list, died, we think, of natural causes all the way back in 1528. Now, Henry Pole was executed, but for treason in 1539. As was his mother Margaret Pole, but she was executed in 1541. So all of these named individuals were dead before Catherine had even married Henry, and not one of them were executed for heresy. The two that were executed for treason. Now we're going to come to our very last point, and I want to finish by highlighting another moment of really good historical accuracy being shown in this film, and that is the decision to have Henry being moved around his palace in a wheeled cart as his health further fails. We did have him using a staff or a cane, which is something we see in the portraiture of him. These wheeled carts were something that the king really had. He also made use of a series of pulleys to help him to get up and down the stairs of his palaces as he got sicker and sicker. So what do you think of this review? Have you seen Firebrand? And if so, what did you think of it? Are you planning to watch it? If you are, what are you most looking forward to? As always, I'm keen to read your conversations in the comments section underneath this video. I'd also love it if you pop an emoji or a social glyph in the comments because that will boost the engagement, and apparently the more engagement a video gets, the more YouTube claim they share it out, and that should help us to grow our community. As we've been talking about the film of the Tudors, I'm thinking either a film-based emoji or something that feels Tudory to you. I look forward to seeing what you pick. You can find me elsewhere on social media. I will leave links to the place you can find me on the internet in my description box. Please do follow me over on some or all of those so we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope that you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, please share it with your friends, and if you like my channel, let some pals know about it. You can tell me you like this video in particular by hitting the thumbs up. Please do subscribe to the channel, and if you think you are subscribed, now is the ideal time to check to make sure that YouTube has not mysteriously unsubscribed you against your will. While you are there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, please do hit the bell icon that sits beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down that will appear. And that way YouTube claim they will tell you when I've next uploaded, but also when I will next be going live, which I promise will be happening soon. Still figuring out the logistics with a little one and a slightly bigger one so that I can come and do a history news live for you all. You are not going to want to miss that. There is, of course, our failsafe. If you head to my website, it will be linked. It is www.katrinamarchant.com. If you head to the contact page, you will see a little box. Please put your email in that box and then hit submit. That will add you to my list so that I can send you out an email once a week so that I can let you know what I've been up to, but also I can send you useful links for my content for the coming days. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.